Ms. Sarah Johnson paused before the limestone steps of the Metropolitan Courthouse, taking a measured breath as she adjusted her crisp blue blazer. The early October morning painted the sky in watercolor shades of pink and gold, casting long shadows across the courthouse plaza. At precisely 8:45 a.m., she began her ascent, each step deliberate and dignified, despite the twinge in her left leg that had become her constant companion. The security line stretched longer than usual for a Tuesday morning. Ms. Johnson stood patiently, observing the mix of people around her, nervous teenagers with their parents, suited attorneys clutching coffee cups, and courthouse staff hurrying through the employee entrance. When her turn came, she greeted the security guard with a warm smile that reached her eyes. "Good morning, ma'am," the guard, whose nameplate read Officer Martinez, said as he checked her ID. His practiced movements slowed for a moment as he studied her driver's license. Something in her bearing caught his attention. Perhaps the way she stood, or the quiet confidence in her demeanor. The metal detector beeped softly as she passed through. "Just my knee brace," Ms. Johnson explained, her voice carrying a gentle authority that came from years of leadership. Officer Martinez nodded respectfully, using his wand to confirm her explanation. The young guard beside him watched the interaction with interest, noting how Ms. Johnson's presence seemed to elevate the routine security check into something more dignified. Inside the courthouse, the marble floors echoed with footsteps and whispered conversations. Ms. Johnson consulted the directory, although she had memorized the room number for traffic court, 317, the moment she received her citation. The elevator was crowded, but people instinctively made space for her, responding to an aura of quiet grace they couldn't quite name. On the third floor, she found a seat in the crowded waiting area, placing her small leather portfolio neatly in her lap. The portfolio contained her documentation, the speeding ticket, her registration, insurance, and the letter from the VA hospital confirming her emergency appointment that day. Everything was organized with military precision, each document in its proper place. A young mother struggling with a fussy toddler sat down beside her. Without hesitation, Ms. Johnson reached into her bag and offered the child a clean tissue and a kind smile. The mother's tense shoulders relaxed slightly at this small act of kindness. Ms. Johnson remembered countless moments in field hospitals where a gentle word or simple gesture had calmed frightened patients. As the minutes ticked by, she observed the proceedings through the courtroom's open door. Judge Richard Matthews' reputation for punctuality and strict adherence to protocol was evident in the efficient progression of cases. His voice carried clearly into the waiting area, firm, authoritative, and somewhat severe. When the court clerk called case number 247, Sarah Johnson, she rose smoothly, gathering her portfolio with steady hands. The morning light streaming through the tall windows caught the silver threads in her neatly braided hair, creating a momentary halo effect. As she walked toward the courtroom doors, several people noticed her remarkable posture and the subtle traces of old medals pinned to her blazer's inner lapel, small details that hinted at a story far deeper than a simple traffic violation. Judge Richard Matthews adjusted his reading glasses as he reviewed the details of case number 247. The morning had been a steady stream of traffic violations, each one blending into the next. He noticed Ms. Johnson standing before him, her occasional glance at her watch drawing his attention. The courtroom's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his already stern features. "Ms. Johnson," he began, his voice carrying the weight of 20 years on the bench, "you were cited for traveling at 47 miles per hour in a 30-mile zone on Cedar Avenue." He paused, looking up from the citation. That's significantly over the limit in a residential area. The gallery behind Ms. Johnson sat in respectful silence. Morning sunlight filtered through the high windows, creating patterns on the polished wooden barriers that separated the observers from the proceedings. A young law clerk scribbled notes, her pen scratching softly against paper. "Your Honor, if I may explain," Ms. Johnson began, her voice clear and measured. "That morning, I received an urgent call from the VA hospital regarding. Judge Matthews raised his hand, cutting off her explanation. Ms. Johnson, I've heard many explanations for speeding over my years on this bench. The posted limits exist for everyone's safety, regardless of our personal circumstances. His tone carried the weariness of someone who had heard every possible excuse. The court clerk, Mr. Wilson, shifted slightly in his chair, his eyes moving between the judge and Ms. Johnson. Something about her composure seemed different from the usual parade of traffic offenders. She stood perfectly still, hands clasped loosely in front of her, showing neither nervousness nor defiance. The citation notes that this occurred at 9:15 a.m. on a school day, Judge Matthews continued, just as children were arriving at Cedar Elementary. He removed his glasses, using them to emphasize his points as he spoke. You understand why this is particularly concerning. Ms. Johnson nodded once, maintaining eye contact with the judge. Yes, Your Honor. I assure you, safety was my primary. The fine for this violation is $275. Judge Matthews interrupted again, already reaching for his gavel. I trust this will serve as a reminder to respect our traffic laws. His tone suggested the matter was settled, another case ready to be filed away and forgotten. The young law clerk glanced up from her notepad, sensing something unusual in Ms. Johnson's dignified silence. Even the small movements of papers and whispers that typically filled the courtroom had ceased, as if the space itself was holding its breath. Ms. Johnson opened her portfolio with deliberate movements, reaching for her wallet. The morning light caught something metallic beneath her blazer, a flash so brief that most observers missed it. But Mr. Wilson, the court clerk, leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing in recognition. Your Honor, Mr. Wilson spoke up, his voice breaking the courtroom's silence. Perhaps we should. The judge raised an eyebrow at this unusual interruption from his usually quiet clerk. Ms. Johnson paused, her hand still on her wallet, as the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted imperceptibly. The story was about to take an unexpected turn. Mr. Wilson, the court clerk, cleared his throat softly. Your Honor, I believe there might be some relevant information in Ms. Johnson's file that warrants your attention. His voice carried a note of quiet certainty that made Judge Matthews pause, his gavel hovering midair. The morning light streaming through the tall courthouse windows had shifted, casting a warm glow across the proceedings. Ms. Johnson remained perfectly still, her posture reflecting years of discipline. As she waited, her hand unconsciously moved to adjust her blazer's lapel, causing a subtle shimmer of metal to catch the light once again. This time, Mr. Wilson saw it clearly, the distinctive edge of a combat medical badge, partially concealed by the fabric. His eyes widened in recognition, memories of his own military service rushing back. 20 years as a court clerk had taught him to notice details, but this one struck particularly close to home. Ms. Johnson, Mr. Wilson addressed her directly, his tone carrying newfound respect. You served in the medical course. The question hung in the air, transforming the atmosphere of the courtroom. Several observers sat up straighter, their attention sharpening. Judge Matthews lowered his gavel, his expression shifting from routine authority to genuine curiosity. The young law clerk stopped her note-taking, pen poised mid-sentence, sensing the weight of the moment. Yes, sir, Ms. Johnson replied simply, her voice carrying the same quiet dignity that had marked her entire presence in the courtroom. She reached inside her blazer, retrieving her military ID with practiced precision. The movement revealed not just the combat medical badge, but also the edge of a ribbon rack that spoke volumes to those who knew how to read such things. A soft murmur rippled through the gallery. An elderly gentleman in the back row slowly stood, his own military bearing evident despite his age. The morning's routine traffic court had suddenly become something entirely different. Mr. Wilson approached the bench, speaking in low tones to Judge Matthews. The judge's expression transformed as he listened, his earlier stern demeanor giving way to something more complex. He studied Ms. Johnson with new eyes, noting details he had overlooked in his rush to process another routine case, The precise way she held herself, the quiet authority in her bearing, the subtle marks of service that had been there all along. "Ms. Johnson," Judge Matthews began again, his tone markedly different. "I believe we should hear your full explanation about the circumstances of that morning." He removed his glasses, cleaning them thoughtfully as he continued, "particularly regarding your VA hospital appointment." The sun chose that moment to emerge fully from behind a cloud, flooding the courtroom with golden light. Ms. Johnson squared her shoulders slightly, a movement so subtle that only those with similar training would recognize its significance. She opened her portfolio again, this time not for her wallet, but for the VA hospital documents she had prepared. "Thank you, Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and steady. The whole courtroom leaned forward slightly, ready to hear the story that would change not just this morning's proceedings, but the way many of them would think about quick judgments for days to come. "I apologize for exceeding the speed limit that morning," Ms. Johnson began, her voice carrying the same steady authority she had once used to command medical evacuation units. "I received an urgent call from the VA hospital, where I serve as a training consultant for emergency medical procedures." She paused, removing a letter from her portfolio. The courthouse air seemed to still as she continued, "But perhaps I should provide some context, Your Honor." The morning light caught the silver threading in her hair as she stood straighter, decades of service evident in her bearing. "For 15 years, I served as a combat nurse, eventually leading emergency response teams." Her words painted pictures that held the courtroom spellbound. "My final rank was lieutenant colonel, commanding a medical evacuation unit specializing in critical care under extreme conditions." Judge Matthews leaned forward slightly, his earlier sternness replaced by genuine interest. The young law clerk had stopped writing entirely, her pen forgotten in her hand. Even the bailiff, a former Marine, stood more attentively at his post. "On my third tour," Ms. Johnson continued, her voice remaining measured, "our unit was dispatched to a remote forward operating base under heavy fire. We had 18 critically wounded soldiers requiring immediate evacuation." She didn't raise her voice for emphasis. She didn't need to. The weight of her words carried their own gravity. Mr. Wilson, the court clerk, nodded almost imperceptibly. He had seen similar citations in her file. The Silver Star, the Purple Heart, but hearing the story behind them transformed mere decorations into something profound. Despite continuous fire, our team completed 3 separate landings that night. Every wounded soldier made it home. She paused, allowing the significance to settle. "That mission earned me the Silver Star, but more importantly, it taught me that every second counts in emergency medicine." The elderly veteran in the back row wiped his eyes quietly. Others in the gallery sat perfectly still, recognizing they were witnessing something extraordinary in what had started as routine traffic court. The VA hospital called that morning because they needed my expertise for a training session on emergency trauma procedures. These sessions help prepare medical staff for critical situations. She gestured to her leg, acknowledging what some had noticed earlier. "My own injuries from that night remind me daily of the importance of this training." Judge Matthews removed his glasses, processing the weight of what he was hearing. The morning sun had risen fully now, its warm light filling the courtroom, as if nature itself was illuminating the truth of her words. "While I regret exceeding the speed limit," Ms. Johnson concluded, "I was responding to what I considered a different kind of emergency, the need to prepare others to save lives." Her words hung in the air, carrying both apology and conviction. The courtroom remained silent for a moment after she finished speaking. It was the kind of silence that follows the sharing of something profound. Not empty, but filled with understanding. Judge Matthews looked down at the traffic citation on his desk, then back at Ms. Johnson, seeing not just another case number, but a lifetime of service and sacrifice standing before him. Judge Matthews carefully reviewed the VA hospital documentation Ms. Johnson had provided. His reading glasses caught the late morning light as he studied the emergency training schedule, noting the precise timing that matched the morning of her citation. The courtroom remained hushed, the usual shuffling of papers and whispered conversations notably absent. "Ms. Johnson," the judge began, his tone markedly different from earlier, "could you explain more about these training sessions?" He held up the VA hospital letter, genuine interest replacing his previous bureaucratic detachment. "Of course, Your Honor," she responded, standing with characteristic poise. The session that morning focused on mass casualty response techniques. We were training new medical staff on procedures I developed during my service. She gestured to a detailed schedule attached to the letter. "These methods have increased survival rates by 30% in emergency situations." The young law clerk, who had been reviewing traffic camera footage on her computer, raised her hand slightly. "Your Honor, if I may." At the judge's nod, she continued, "The traffic footage from that morning shows Ms. Johnson's vehicle maintaining perfect lane discipline despite the speed. She signaled all turns and maintained safe distances from other vehicles." Mr. Wilson, the court clerk, added his own observation. "The citation notes that she pulled over immediately when signaled, Your Honor, and was exemplarily cooperative with the officer." He shuffled through additional papers, "And I found her driving record, not a single citation in 20 years of driving." Judge Matthews removed his glasses, cleaning them thoughtfully as he absorbed this information. The morning light had shifted, casting softer shadows across the courtroom. Several observers leaned forward, sensing the weight of the moment. "Ms. Johnson," the judge spoke again, "this training you provide, it's voluntary." His question carried genuine curiosity rather than judgment. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied. "After my medical retirement, I couldn't imagine not passing on what I'd learned. Every technique we teach," she paused briefly, touching her leg unconsciously, "comes from real experience. Experience that costs something, but might save others." The elderly veteran in the back row nodded silently, understanding written across his features. A young medical student, present for an unrelated case, scribbled notes frantically, clearly inspired by what she was hearing. Judge Matthews studied the traffic citation again, seeing it with new eyes. The black and white simplicity of 47 in a 30 had transformed into something far more complex. He thought about split-second decisions, about responsibility, about the weight of experience earned in the hardest possible ways. "The officer who issued this citation," he began slowly, "noted that you were apologetic and explained about the VA hospital. He looked up at Ms. Johnson. He wrote that you seemed more concerned about being late for others than about the ticket itself." A soft murmur of understanding rippled through the gallery. The morning's proceedings had transformed from a simple traffic court session into something that felt more like a lesson in judgment and understanding. The sunlight streaming through the high windows seemed to underscore the moment, the illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like silent witnesses to this shift in perspective. Judge Matthews set aside his papers and removed his reading glasses, an uncharacteristic gesture that caught the attention of the regular courtroom staff. His next words surprised everyone present, including himself. "My son James is stationed at Fort Bragg," he said quietly, his judicial formality softening. "He's a combat medic." The judge's fingers traced the edge of his desk, a gesture that seemed to ground him in the moment. 2 months ago, he wrote to me about a training session that changed how his unit handles battlefield trauma. Ms. Johnson's eyes showed a flash of recognition. The courtroom remained still, sensing the personal nature of this unexpected turn. The morning light had softened, casting gentle shadows across the judge's face as he continued. He described new techniques for emergency response that his instructor had learned in Afghanistan. Judge Matthews looked directly at Ms. Johnson. "Techniques that saved his entire team last month during a training accident. I believe, Ms. Johnson, that was your program he was describing." A warm smile touched Ms. Johnson's face as understanding dawned. "The Fort Bragg initiative," she nodded. "We implemented those protocols last quarter." She shifted slightly, her professional demeanor warming. "Your son's unit showed exceptional promise in adapting those techniques. In fact, their success has become a model for other bases. The young law clerk watched this exchange with growing appreciation, her earlier notes forgotten. The bailiff, still at attention, allowed himself a small smile. Even Mr. Wilson seemed moved by this unexpected connection. James wrote that the instructor told them every protocol was written in blood and experience. The judge continued, his voice carrying newfound respect, that these weren't just classroom theories, but lessons learned in the hardest possible ways. Ms. Johnson nodded solemnly. We teach what we've lived, Your Honor. Every procedure, every quick decision. She paused, choosing her words carefully. They all come from moments where seconds meant the difference between life and death. The elderly veteran in the back row stood up straighter, his own memories clearly stirred. A few other observers wiped their eyes discreetly, touched by the humanity of the moment. This morning, Judge Matthews spoke thoughtfully. I was prepared to simply process another traffic violation. He gestured to the citation on his desk. Instead, I'm reminded that behind every case, there's a story we need to hear, a context we need to understand. The sunlight shifted again, warming the wood panels behind the judge's bench. The American flag in the corner stirred slightly in the air conditioning, its presence seeming more poignant than usual. Your son, Ms. Johnson said softly, he carries himself with the same dedication I see in all our best medics. The willingness to put others first, to move quickly when seconds count. She smiled warmly. You should be very proud. Judge Matthews nodded, a father's pride briefly overshadowing his judicial authority. The courtroom witnessed this moment of shared understanding. No longer a judge and a traffic violator, but two people connected by service, sacrifice, and the understanding that sometimes the most important stories lie beneath the surface. Judge Matthews straightened in his chair, his judicial demeanor returning, though now tempered with visible respect. The morning had grown late, sunlight streaming directly through the high windows, but no one in the courtroom showed any sign of impatience. Ms. Johnson, he began, his tone carrying both authority and warmth, this court has the discretion to consider alternative resolutions when circumstances warrant. He picked up his pen, making several thoughtful notes. I believe this is such a case. The regular courtroom attendees exchanged curious glances. Judge Matthews was known for his strict adherence to standard penalties, making this moment particularly noteworthy. The city's first responder training program has been seeking experienced instructors, he continued, consulting a document on his desk. They specifically requested someone who could bridge the gap between military and civilian emergency response protocols. Ms. Johnson's eyes lit up with interest, though she maintained her composed demeanor. The young law clerk smiled, already anticipating where this was heading. Instead of a monetary fine, Judge Matthews proposed, I'd like to offer an alternative. Would you be willing to conduct a series of training sessions for our local first responders? He leaned forward slightly. Your expertise could benefit our entire community. Your Honor, Ms. Johnson responded, her voice carrying quiet enthusiasm. I would be honored. She opened her portfolio, revealing a carefully organized set of training outlines. I've actually been developing a civilian adaptation of our combat response protocols. The judge nodded approvingly. Mr. Wilson, he addressed the court clerk, please coordinate with the Emergency Services Department. We'll want to schedule. He glanced at Ms. Johnson inquiringly. 6 sessions would allow us to cover the essential protocols, she offered. We could focus on rapid response, team coordination, and crisis management under pressure. Her hands moved slightly as she spoke, unconsciously demonstrating the precision that had marked her military career. The young medical student in the gallery had abandoned all pretense of waiting for her own case, frantically taking notes. Several other observers sat forward, clearly interested in the possibility of attending these sessions. I believe this solution serves justice better than any fine, Judge Matthews declared. Not only does it address the letter of the law, but it also brings valuable knowledge to our community. He smiled slightly. Sometimes the best resolutions come from unexpected circumstances. Ms. Johnson stood straighter, if that was possible. "I'll ensure the training materials are adapted for civilian emergency response teams," she said. "There are many techniques we developed in combat that could save lives here at home." The elderly veteran in the back row nodded approvingly, while Mr. Wilson was already making notes about scheduling and coordination. The bailiff, himself a former emergency responder, showed keen interest in the proposed training. Additionally, the judge continued, "I'm going to recommend that the city traffic department review the speed limits around medical facilities." He made another note. "Sometimes our regulations need to be examined in light of real-world circumstances." The morning sunlight had reached its peak, filling the courtroom with warm, clear light. What had begun as a simple traffic violation had transformed into an opportunity for community advancement, a bridge between military expertise and civilian needs. 3 months after that memorable morning in traffic court, the training room at the City Emergency Services Center buzzed with anticipation. Ms. Johnson stood at the front, her blue blazer replaced by professional medical attire, addressing a packed room of first responders, medical students, and emergency personnel. The changes sparked by that courtroom encounter had exceeded everyone's expectations. Judge Matthews sat in the back row, having made time in his busy schedule to attend this final session of the training series. Beside him, his son James, home on leave, watched with professional interest as Ms. Johnson demonstrated a technique he'd used himself just months before: time and precision. Ms. Johnson's voice carried clearly through the room. "Make the difference between life and death. Each movement must have purpose." Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she showed a modified version of a battlefield medical procedure adapted for civilian emergency response. The audience included faces from that fateful morning in court. The young medical student who'd been waiting for her own case, now an enthusiastic participant in every session. The elderly veteran who'd become a regular attendee, often sharing his own experiences during discussion periods, and Mr. Wilson, who'd helped coordinate the entire program. Local emergency response times had already improved by 20% since implementing Ms. Johnson's protocols. The City Council had taken notice, voting to expand the program to neighboring communities. What had begun as a traffic violation had transformed into a regional initiative for emergency response improvement. Judge Matthews had made changes too. His courtroom now featured a modified scheduling system that allowed more time for understanding the context behind each case. The success of Ms. Johnson's alternative sentence had inspired him to seek similar creative resolutions when appropriate. Today's final exercise, Ms. Johnson announced, will demonstrate how military precision and civilian resources can work together. She smiled at a group of paramedics who had attended every session. "You've all shown remarkable dedication in adapting these techniques to your daily work." The morning sun streamed through the training room windows, reminiscent of that day in court. A local news crew quietly filmed from the corner, preparing a story about the program's success. Their previous coverage had already inspired 3 other cities to implement similar initiatives. As the session concluded, Judge Matthews approached the front of the room. "Ms. Johnson," he said warmly, "I believe this has served justice far better than any fine could have." He gestured to the room full of trained emergency responders. "You've turned one moment of haste into a lasting benefit for our entire community." The city's emergency services director stepped forward, holding an official letter. "We'd like to make this program permanent," she announced. "Ms. Johnson, would you consider taking on the role of emergency response training coordinator?" The room erupted in applause. Ms. Johnson's eyes shone with emotion as she accepted both the offer and the responsibility it represented. The ripples from that courtroom morning had become waves of positive change, touching lives far beyond the original circumstances. As the room buzzed with excitement and congratulations, the elderly veteran was heard remarking to a young paramedic, "Sometimes the best justice isn't about punishment. It's about finding the right way to serve." Judge Matthews, overhearing this, nodded in quiet agreement. In his decades on the bench, He'd never seen a traffic violation transform into something quite so meaningful.